Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing just, again, another build that I just sort of came up with on the spot. I was looking for ideas for builds by going back through my more recent videos to see if I could find a class that I hadn't really done in a while. And to my surprise, it's been a hot minute since I've done a proper Bard build. Oddly enough. And then I thought, okay, well, what's a class combo that I haven't really done before, or at least haven't done very much, that could be interesting to explore, you know, thematically. And then I kind of realized, hey, I've never really combined Bard and Cleric. I was originally going to do Bard and Barbarian, you know, the Barbarian, but I decided that I wanted to try this first, a Bard-Cleric combo. And in actuality, I think it creates quite an interesting character, because you can get someone who is probably one of the best support builds you can make, because you get bards, which get bardic inspiration, which are all about being, you know, support characters anyway, unless you decide to play swords bard, in which case you're the best, one of the best martial fighters in the game. Then you also have cleric, who's also focused on support in a lot of ways, you know, through healing and various buffing spells and yada yada yada. So I thought a union of the two could be quite interesting. But then what do you do for the theming? And then I thought, wait, both cleric and bard have classes that are focused on martial combat. And then that got me thinking, what if we make some sort of like warlord, a battlefield commander type build, in a sense, that's all about, you know, the literal song of war, a war song, like beating the drums of war to signal the start of combat and embolden their allies or their soldiers or whatever. And I got into the build, I got testing it, and there were some issues with it. Obviously, the stat split sucks. We want both high wisdom and charisma, but I've got plenty of ways of patching that up, and the build works just fine from that perspective. Solved that. The problem is then I had a lot of trouble with concentration saving throws. So I had to make a quick change to the armor selection in order to compensate for that, which fixed the problem. And then when I saw what the build looked like, I'm like, you know what? Let's just get Shadowheart. I think it fits her quite nicely to be this kind of like, you know, support like singing bard cleric, and like she's kind of got like her musical instrument and she's kind of like supporting her allies and giving them orders and such. I don't know, I think it can work for her actually, because you know she's got kind of that moody bossy attitude about her that could carry over into her combat style, where she's actually bossing people around on the battlefield and very begrudgingly giving them support. She's like, oh, I can't believe you went and ran into another trap, I better heal you now, take this bless and go. Like that sort of thing, right? You will notice though that because I've made this pretty much a pure support build with a bit of martial capability, I decided for the testing today I would actually bring in Karlach to help me test. Because while this build does work solo, it can kind of do everything. The healing, the buffing, the martial stuff. I actually wanted to test a support build with another character. So in the solo testing, it did have a little bit of trouble. The slightly lower overall HP pool meant that things like Steel Watchers could actually give this build a little bit of trouble. But otherwise, you do actually have quite a few options to kind of mitigate damage and such like that. But when you work with at least one other party member, this build absolutely shines. Especially Karlach, who in this video is showing off my original origin build for her, the 4 Elements Monk Berserker Barbarian. Which I think just worked really, really nicely. This combo was really, really fun. So yeah, you stick this build next to even just one other party member, and it will do its job absolutely brilliantly. Once I'd fixed the concentration save problem, we were absolutely golden. And speaking of golden, look at this armor. We'll get into the build just now, but look at this armor. This is Feywild Green and Dun Dun Dai on the Dark Justitia armor via the regular version that you get without being evil. Like, holy hell, this looks amazing! I just wanted to point out the way this armor looks, because damn, this is an amazing color for this. Anyway, sidetrack over, let's get into the build. Now, the fun part about this build is, like, obviously we're mixing Bard and Cleric here, but the thing is when it comes to, like, proficiencies or whatever, it doesn't actually matter which levels you take in which order. We're still going to have the same spellcasting modifier for both Wisdom and Charisma by the time this build is finished. So in reality, unless you change the stats around, you don't actually have to worry about which class you multi-class into lost for the sake of using item DCs and all that. So it's actually entirely up to you if you want to start with Cleric or with Bard. I'm going to be starting with Bard because I think the way I think this build should progress throughout the game should focus on Bard first, with maybe a quick dip into Cleric to start, but after that you'll go to Cleric afterwards. It depends on whether or not you want things like Spirit Guardians early, or if you want the extra attack from Bard early, because yes, we are taking a class that gets extra attack. So there is a few different ways you could go about this. This build is quite free in kind of how you can take the leveling scheme, but I personally think going Bard with a quick Cleric dip, then going the rest of the Cleric after the Bard levels is the best way to do it. But so I'm going to show off starting off with a Bard today. With Bard, we're going to gain access to all of your weapon proficiencies that you really need for this build, and when we multi-class into Cleric, we're going to get all of the armor and weapon proficiencies anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Armor, again, doesn't really matter. We're mainly going to be here for skills, and we're going to get more skills by starting off as a Bard, which I think is really nice, because we're going to have high charisma, wisdom, and we're going to have decent intelligence. So this is actually going to be great for being a party face as well, if you maybe decide to play Shadowheart as an origin, which you can absolutely do with this build, and actually I would kind of recommend it. It would feel quite fun. Again, you're the main character of the story, and you're the one who's kind of like positioning your pieces and moving characters around the board and supporting them and doing this and doing that. I actually think this could be a fun Shadowheart origin build, but it's entirely up to you. Next up, cantrips, Vicious Mockery and Friends, because of course. Next up, spells. We're going to start off with Dissonant Whispers for a decent damage option, Psychic, which is not often resisted, and can potentially frighten creatures. Again, it's the Bard's bread and butter level 1 damage spell, you might as well take it. Next up, Heroism, a great spell, making you immune to Frightened, or you yourself or an ally immune to Frightened, and you or your ally will also gain 5 temporary hit points each turn, and if you upcast this spell, you can target multiple people. So, in the early game, you can get 1 or 2, either yourself or a couple of allies, buffed up with this, and it's a really solid early game concentration option. I highly, highly recommend it. Next up, Speak with Animals. We're the face of the party, we might as well speak to everybody. This is great because it unlocks a ton of gameplay stuff that a lot of people would otherwise miss. And next up, Thunderwave. Again, we're kind of going for like a vibe of like beating the drums of war. Again, we want to use sound as part of our arsenal, so getting our hands on Thunderwave is going to feel really, really nice. There's a weird sound effect playing in the background right now, and I'm not entirely sure what is causing it, so I'm going to turn sound effects off for a minute, because that is going to get really annoying if that stays on the whole video. Apologies, everyone. Next up, starting instrument, the drum, because of course. And next up, our ability scores. Now, yes, strength and dexterity are both at 8, because yes, we are using the gloves of dexterity with this build. I would say as when you first start this build, you're gonna want to play this a bit risky. I would say maybe drop down wisdom a little bit and bump up your dexterity a bit more, and kind of have stats that look like this to start with, but then once you kind of get the gloves of dexterity, bump that down to an 8, bump your intelligence up to a 12, and bump your wisdom up to 16. I said 16, thank you. But by the time we're finished this build, you will actually have 18 strength and 18 dexterity, because we're going to use an item to get strength as well, so you're going to have pretty solid stats across the board by the time this is all said and done. So I think it's actually going to work out quite nicely. But anyways, skill proficiencies. Because Shadowheart is an acolyte, she gains religion and insight right off the bat. Perfect. I would have taken at least religion if we didn't already get it. So that leaves us with 3 skills, and let's take Deception, Performance, and Persuasion. Performance is kind of a whatever skill, actually. If you'd rather take Intimidation instead, that's fine, but I kind of like Performance more for the roleplay and being able to play the instrument better and all that. So it's entirely up to you, so I'm going to go with Performance just because I want to, but Intimidation would probably be the better choice, or maybe something from up here, but I like Performance. Right, next up at Total Level 2, we are going to be jumping straight over to Cleric for a 1 level dip, like I said. With Cleric, you're going to gain access to a few things with the level 1 dip. Like I say, you're going to gain access to a few cantrips. I'm going to drop Resistance here, keeping Guidance and Sacred Flame, to also grab Thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy is going to be great if you're playing on Tactician or higher in place of Friends when making Intimidation or Performance checks. So I would say this kind of makes up for the fact that we didn't take Intimidation proficiency, but if you, again, you could swap either of those around and still you'd be able to get advantage, but just by using Thaumaturgy, so either or you take, you're still going to be good at it. Next up, our subclass. Obviously Shadowheart would default to Trickery Domain, but again, I want to play this kind of like War Commander type build that is also good in martial combat in its own right, so I am picking War Domain, but honestly, any domain will work. I could see Tempest also being quite fun, or if you wanted to keep it based on Shadowheart, keep it with Trickery. Life can also be great if you want to be a healing Cleric as well, but War Domain is going to give us everything we want, namely martial weapons and heavy armor, so now we have access to the full smorgasbord of weapons and armor that we could possibly want to use. And in the early game, I would recommend picking up heavy armor as well. I think that's going to be better until you pick up this armor here, which is medium armor. And in fact, if you wanted to use heavy armor with this build, perhaps the armor of persistence instead, if you don't care about the concentration saves, and you can actually drop your dexterity and such like that. Feel free to move stats around, move equipment around, and make this concept kind of what you want it to be. But we're going to go with War Domain for now. War Domain is going to give us a bunch of stuff that is going to help both ourselves and our allies. We're going to get Divine Favor, allowing us to deal additional radiant damage if we want with our weapon attacks. We also can grab Shield of Faith to cast on ourselves or an ally to buff their armor class by 2, but we gain War Priest, which is obviously the main thing, which means whenever we make an unarmed or weapon attack, we can spend a War Priest charge to make an additional attack as a bonus action. This is going to allow us to be able to kind of get a more limited version of extra attack really early on, giving us a bit of that martial capability while allow us to still do all of the bard stuff that we want until we end up getting extra attack properly. So you're going to feel a bit of the kind of theme of this build come on with just this one level dip. You're going to get your cleric cantrips, which are basically a huge part of the class's identity. You're going to gain access to your subclass, which is going to give you War Priest and make you a bit more martial focused, and you're also going to gain access to your spells. With your spells, you're going to have access to quite a few things that are going to be very, very on theme for the build. Sanctuary obviously is always great, being able to protect yourself or an ally from harm, and let yourself kind of, maybe if you wanted to just be the commander, just focus on healing and support, and you don't have to worry about being attacked. But of course, as soon as you go to attack someone, this will break, or if you need to get an ally out of a sticky situation, just cast this on them and protect them with your own magic. Works in many different situations and is perfect for this build. Next up, I would say we're going to grab the healing spells from Cleric specifically, just because I want to take other stuff off our Bard levels, so we're going to have the healing spells here. And then finally, I think Guiding Bolt, again, a pretty bog standard option here, but it's going to work great for us. It's going to give us a big dollop of radiant damage that we can deal, and the next attack roll against the target will have advantage, so that helps us and the whole party, so overall, I think it's perfect. Next up, we are going to go back to Bard, because again, I think now that we've got a lot of the Cleric flavouring and a lot of the great utility that's going to come from that one level tip of Cleric, let's focus on the Bard stuff and get all of that good stuff from there. So, with level 2 of Bard, we're going to gain access to Jack of all Trades and Song of Rest for 2 classic Bard features for this game. Jack of all Trades is going to make us a little bit good at everything, and Song of Rest is a third short rest, which is just always amazing. We're also going to get access to another spell at this level, and it's entirely up to you what you want to pick here, it really doesn't matter. I'm going to try and avoid getting too many concentration spells on this build, because obviously this build is going to be a bit concentration heavy, because a lot of the good support and buffing spells, they are concentration, so we're going to try and work around that. So I think Longstrider just being a fairly good buff just in general, just more movement speed is never ever going to go amiss. Just cast it on everyone at the start of the day and you're good to go. Might as well just pick this up. Next up, our subclass. Now obviously I specified picking a martial subclass, but the question is, which one? Actually, if you wanted to focus less on the martial side of things, any of these subclasses would work. College of Law would give you access to more spells and another way to use a Bardic Inspiration die to shout at enemies to debuff them, as well as buffing your allies, with the regular Bardic Inspiration. So if you wanted to go for College of Law, pick up some more skills, you absolutely could. College of Swords, obviously, if you wanted to lean more into the full martial style, you could pick up the dueling fighting style, because this is going to use a weapon and a shield this build, and you could obviously pick up the maneuvers and all of that to be able to do even more damage. So if you want to be more of a frontline fighter, go for this. But for the theme of this build, again about buffing our allies and commanding them, I want College of Valour. College of Valour is going to give a buff to our Bardic Inspiration, allowing it to apply to attack rolls, ability checks, saving throws, weapon damage, or armor class. So your allies are going to have a ton of different options for how to use that Bardic Inspiration to be able to buff various aspects of their kit. You get all the usual Bardic Inspiration stuff, or they can buff their weapon damage or armor class, attack or defense. It's extremely fun to utilize, and by the time we've done the leveling with this build, we're going to have access to this resource pretty much constantly, so this is going to feel extremely fun to use. It feels like a very clerical ability, if I'm being honest. Mixing this with War Cleric just feels so So right, I can't explain it. And again, once we have the full levels for this build, you're just going to see how nicely everything feels together, how everything like synergizes. It's extremely fun. Anyways, spells. We now have access to level 2 spells, and one spell that I really, really liked on this build, and I can't really explain why, is Cloud of Daggers. Yes, it's another concentration spell, but the idea of us being this kind of martial, like, battlefield control support commander type who could just summon floating weapons to attack a specific area, I don't know, it just felt right, and it's quite a powerful spell as well, so I actually quite like having it around as a bit of a control option, but feel free to swap this out if you so desire. Next up, at Bard level 4, we're going to gain access to another cantrip. Choose whatever you like here, it really doesn't matter. I'll go with Mage Hand because it has a lot of utility. Next up, we do get to pick another level 2 spell, and I'm going to go with probably Hold Person here. Hold Person is just a generally good spell to have. Again, you're going to take a humanoid enemy out of combat, and any attacks that you or your allies make against them are always going to be critical hits. So if you're up against a quite powerful humanoid enemy, then this is actually a really, really good shout. Otherwise, you've got a few other things here that could also make sense. I like Blindness for attack to give attack rolls advantage against an enemy. We've got Crown of Madness if you want to go down that route. Enhanced ability would feel very on theme, so feel free to pick that up. Choose whatever you like here. Next up, we do get a feat at this level, and I think at this point we do just need to take an ability score improvement. Again, we would obviously have the gloves of dexterity at this point, so our dexterity is at 18, we don't have to worry about our melee stuff. Constitution with the armor that we're going to have is fine at 14. Intelligence we don't need, it's just there for roleplay stuff, so wisdom or charisma is going to be our bag, and since we're taking the bard levels now, we're going to be going for charisma. Next up at Bard level 5, we're going to get the kind of big part of the Bard kit that we want. We're going to get Font of Inspiration, meaning that our Bardic Inspiration now recovers on a short rest as well as a long rest, so we're going to have access to our Combat Inspiration pretty much all the time. Not to mention our Combat Inspiration has also had a buff, buffing the bonus from a d6 to a d8, so that is really, really nice for us. That could be up to an 8 increase to damage or armor class, which is just insane. Next up, spells. We do get to pick another spell at this point, and for a solid concentration option that allows you to both control the battlefield and deal damage, non-concentration option I should say, Glyph of Warding is one of my favourite spells in the game. If you want to, it's basically a diet fireball that can do multiple different elements or effects, like sleep, force, pushing people back, fire, thunder, lightning, there's a few different ones. Or you can set it as a trap. It doesn't need your concentration to be there. You can set it up in a choke point, and enemies are either forced to walk on it or go around it, wasting their movement. It's a really, really good spell for maintaining control and kind of strategically maintaining the battlefield. Only one glyph can be active at a time, unfortunately, but again, if placed well, it can be an extremely useful asset to your party, so I like picking up Glyph of Warding here. And finally, at Bard level 6, we're going to get a few things. Counter Charm allows us to play our song to, basically buff our allies for 3 turns. They gain advantage on saving throws against being charmed and frightened. It's not great. 3 turns for that effect as an action on your turn is not amazing. If this was a bonus action, it would actually be pretty cool, but the visual and audio effect is quite nice. It does summon a spectral music box with a little aura around it that plays the music box rendition of the main theme, so it's a fun little thing to have for flavor, but honestly, should have been a bonus action. Anyways, our main thing that we're going to be getting at this level, though, of course, is extra attack, which means, yes, at total level 7, we're getting extra attack, which, I mean, for most martial fighters would suck, but we're not a pure martial fighter now, are we? We're a spellcaster, we're a support build, we're doing everything else other than just attacking, but now we have a bit more mainstay power in martial combat, so we definitely want to pick this up here, and it's one of the reasons why I thought Bard would probably feel more comfortable for a lot of people to level first, because at this point you're kind of getting towards the mid to end of Act 2, and this is a perfect time to pick up extra attack in that sense. Next up, we do get another level 3 spell, and again, it's a pick your favourite situation. I'm going to go with Enhance Ability because I think it makes sense for this build, but it's entirely up to you if you want to grab something else. Now, that is it for our Bard levels. We are going to be jumping over to Cleric now for the rest of the levels. And again, if you wanted to change things up, you could have taken more Cleric levels at any point up until now, but I'm just kind of showing off what we've got available to us now. So, first up, we're going to gain access to our Channel Divinity, which recovers on a short or long rest, now same as the Bardic Inspiration, so we're going to have all of our fun class-based resources coming back on a short rest, which is great. We get Turn Undead, standard for all clerics, but the main thing we're getting is from our War Domain is Guided Strike, giving us a +10 bonus to our own attack rolls. So we're pretty much, as long as we have a Channel Divinity to spend, we're pretty much always going to hit with our attacks, which is quite nice. Next up, we do get to prepare our spells, and I do have to re-prepare them, so let's grab the Healing, Guiding Bolt, and Sanctuary, and of course we're going to grab Command. We're a battlefield commander, we want to command things. We can command a opposing creature to flee, move closer, freeze, drop to the ground, or drop their weapon. Just a fun spell overall that I quite like to have and feels appropriate for this build. Again, it's using our voice to do things, which, I mean, we're a bard, it's what we're supposed to do. Next up, at Cleric level 3, we gain access to level 2 Cleric spells, and because we're a War Domain Cleric, we're going to gain access to Spiritual Weapon, which is awesome, we could just use that whenever, as well as Magic Weapon, which we can use to buff ourselves or our allies to make their weapons even stronger. It fits for the build, but it's probably not the best concentration option out of the ones that we have. Next up, we do have access to level 2 spells, and the game has picked Warding Bond. I'm certainly not going to argue, allowing us to ward an ally, giving them resistance to all damage and a +1 bonus to their armor class and saving throws, with the caveat being that each time they take damage, we take the same amount. Of course, they resist all damage, so we're going to be taking resisted damage, but obviously that does put us in a bit of a sticky wicket. We don't have the highest amount of HP, but if we really have that one ally that we absolutely want to just get in there and get into the thick of it and not have to worry about things as much, and of course we could just heal ourselves anyway, and our allies, so it's not a huge deal. Warding Bond is actually going to feel quite fun for this build, so I like picking it up here. Next up, at level 4, we're going to gain access to another Cleric cantrip. Let's just grab Resistance. Next up, we do gain access to another spell, and we do have quite a few of these already from Bard, surprisingly enough, but I actually do want to pick up Blindness here, because again, it's a non-concentration option that allows us to gain advantage on attack rolls against a creature, and that creature will attack with disadvantage. That, for a non-concentration option, that is actually extremely strong for us and the whole party, so I definitely recommend this. Basically, this build supports Sharpshooter and Great Weapon Master builds extremely well. Next up, ability score improvement, we're going for Wisdom to bump that up to an 18. Yes, we don't really have any of our spellcasting modifiers capped in this build, but we have ways of making up for that anyway. And of course, you could technically optimize this build with Auntie Ethel's hair and the mirror and the boon and yada yada yada. You get the point. People who know how to optimize will optimize if they feel necessary. Next up, at Cleric level 5, we get Destroy Undead, meaning our turn undead can now do radiant damage to undead. We also gain access to Spirit Guardians added automatically to our spell list, which of course I was going to be taking anyway. We're up close in melee, we want Spirit Guardians as a concentration option. We also have access to Crusader's Mantle, which allows us to radiate a holy aura that allows our allies to deal an additional 1d4 radiant damage with their weapon attacks. Both great concentration options for this build. In fact, that's the main problem with this build. You have so many great concentration options, it's going to be hard to pick and choose which ones to use at the time, but mix it up, use a bit of variety. Don't just always go for what you think is the best option, see what else works. Who knows, you might find it fun. We also gain access to level 3 spells, of course, which means we get to pick up some useful spells. I'm going to be grabbing Mass Healing Word and Revivify, because again, we're kind of going for that kind of healer support type of build. I want to pick up this sort of thing. And finally, at level 6 of Cleric, we are going to gain access to a second Channel Divinity Charge, and also War God's Blessing, which means that now that +10 bonus to attack rolls that we have can now apply to our allies, meaning that we have another way of helping our allies. So that means we have healing spells, buffing spells, combat inspiration, War God's Blessing. We just have so much stuff. It is absolutely awesome. We also do gain access to another spell at this point, and just take whatever you like. We can grab Aid if we like, just to give all of our allies a bit of extra hit points. It's a very powerful spell, so why not? And that is the build. Shadowheart, you're very close to the camera. Why? Oh well. That is the build, as I said, and overall what you're going to be getting out of this is a lot of stuff. I mean, you have basically a way to approach any situation. You want to get in there and start swinging with your weapon, you've got plenty of options. You've got up to 3 attacks per turn, which is insane, and you can do that 4 times per long rest. You want to support your allies, you've got Bardic Inspiration, Sanctuary, Crusader's Mantle, Guidance for roleplays, Guiding Bolt for damage and support, Vicious Mockery for damage and support, like Heroism, Cloud of Daggers. You have battlefield control with things like Cloud of Daggers and such. You have stuff that works outside of combat, like Song of Rest. You're just going to have, like, basically just having this build in your party is going to make everything feel so much better. You'll have ways of just getting that little bit of a boost you need in dialogue, combat, everything. even getting an extra short rest. It's just amazing. This build is a one-stop shop for everything while having a fun flavoring, a fun theme, and again, always, I love mixing martial and spellcasting. It's one of my favorite things you can do in D&D. It's why I'm really looking forward to DC 20 and its Spellblade class. Definitely going to be covering that system when it comes out, by the way, because holy damn, that shit looks cool. Huge shout out to the Dungeon Coach for that, because damn, that system looks fun. Anyways, completely off track. But yeah, like I said, you're going to get a little bit of everything. You're going to get the best of both worlds when it comes to Bard and Cleric. You're going to have a fun time. And also, because we've multi-class 2 full casters, we gain access to level 6 spell slots, meaning that we can upcast all of these spells to the absolute limit to get any sort of utility or damage we want out of any of them. Absolutely brilliant. I think this build will fit perfectly in pretty much any party composition that wants a bit of healing and support, while still being able to do a ton of cool stuff on top of that. But never mind all that, let's get into the equipment. I'm just going to position the camera. There we go. So for the equipment, we've got a lot of pretty bog standard stuff here. But I did kind of, like I say, kind of had to grab some items in order to make up some shortcomings of the build. But overall, I think it actually did create a slightly more interesting build overall, so I think we're good. The first thing I will point out, obviously, is the Gloves of Dexterity, like I said, to buff up that Dexterity score to an 18. We do need it, unfortunately, unless you want to wear heavy armor, in which case you could just bump Dex down to a 10. Bump Dex up to a 10, I should say, bump it up, and then put the rest of those points into something else. I don't know. It's a bit tricky. You'll have to kind of mess around and see what you can do here, but if you don't want to use the Gloves of Dex, but otherwise, I do kind of recommend them, as that higher initiative score is going to be great for setting up your buffs early if you're not prepared ahead of combat. But anyways, let's get into the rest of the build like we normally would. First up, the Handmaiden's Mace. This is an interesting weapon. Obviously, it comes from Viconia Devere, who is Shadowheart's boss, shall we say, who she eventually kills if she goes down her good route, which I would personally recommend that you do because I quite like it. It automatically sets your strength to 18, which is quite nice. It's a +2 weapon, and it deals an additional 1d6 of poison damage and has the capability to inflict the poisoned condition. It doesn't say so here, but when I attacked with this weapon in combat, it did apply poison, so hey ho, it works. So overall, it's a really, really solid weapon. It's going to give us basically solid stats across the board, as you can see up there. Obviously, this is totally optional if you want to focus on a finesse weapon in order to be able to use your dexterity for your attacks. That's absolutely fine. But I quite like the class identity of the cleric with the mace, so I wanted to pick up a mace in this build, and that is a great option. But again, speaking of finesse options, finesse? Yeah, it's one of the two. Speaking of finesse options, your early game option with the Gloves of Dexterity is going to be the Rupturing Blade, which is a rapier. This is going to have a +1 bonus to attack and damage rolls, which is fine, as well as the unique attack Searing Blood, allowing you to deal a bunch of piercing and fire damage to your opponent, while you yourself take a d6 of slashing damage. A pretty small price to pay overall. Just a great early game weapon that's going to work with our dexterity, so it will be your go-to martial weapon until you pick up something later on, which in my opinion should be the Handmaiden's Mace. But maybe something like the Infernal Rapier could also work in kind of late Act 2. It's entirely up to you. Next up, the Shield of Devotion. Just a solid shield all around. It gets you everything you want from a regular shield, +2 to armor class and shield bash. However, you also gain an additional level 1 spell slot, which is great. We now have a total of 5, as well as the ability to cast Aid on yourself at level 3. So if you ever just need a quick bump to your hit points, you could just grab it. It's kind of useless when we already have regular Aid, but it's there in case you don't want to spend that spell slot. But again, having that extra level 1 spell slot is nice, and it's just a great looking shield for this build overall. But of course, no, that is an Act 2 option, so I don't need to talk about early game options, but we will need to talk about early game options when it comes to the Fabricated Arbalest. Just a generally great heavy crossbow, and I felt like heavy crossbows kind of worked for this build, so I wanted to pick one up here. You're going to get, it's a +2 weapon, which is great. You're going to gain access to Illuminating Shots, which means you're always going to be able to attack with a bonus action, as this is a bonus action attack with no other resources required. It only does 1d4 piercing, but it can inflict Radiating Orb, which will give the enemy a penalty to their attack rolls for each stack of the condition. We'll only be able to get 1 stack at a time, but hey, a -1 to attack rolls is still a -1 to attack rolls. It can help. and it can help you and your allies. So just basically always having access to that little bit of bonus action damage is great. You also do gain access to Dazzling Ray, which is basically a weaker sunbeam, does a bit less damage, but it has all the kind of same effects, and you can kind of recast it as long as you maintain the concentration, so it's a fun thing to have there. But in the other game, if you want a decent heavy crossbow, you've got the Giant Breaker. Your weapon hits so hard that it sends the target reeling for 2 turns, which also applies a -1 penalty to attack rolls. So overall, just pick what you like. But I quite liked having a heavy crossbow on this build, but you can throw any ranged weapon on here you like, as we have access to all of them. Next up, for our equipment, we have the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. This is just a pretty standard slot here. Whenever you deal damage with a weapon attack, you gain Arcane Acuity for 2 turns, and Arcane Acuity is going to increase your spell attack rolls and spell difficulty class, basically just making us a more effective spellcaster for hitting with our melee weapon, which is what we already want to be doing. But if you want the reverse of that, you can go for the Diadem of Arcane Synergy. Whenever you inflict a condition, which basically most of our spells do, you gain Arcane Synergy for 2 turns, which increases your weapon damage equal to your spellcasting ability modifier. This will be our Wisdom, because we took Cleric as our last multiclass, but it doesn't matter because we have an 18 in Wisdom and Charisma. Anyway, that's what I was talking about earlier. So basically this would mean that for spellcasting, our weapon attacks get more powerful. So you can have either or, more powerful spellcasting for weapon attacks, or more powerful weapon attacks from spellcasting. Entirely up to you. Either all of these will work, but honestly you can kind of slot anything in this slot if you're not worried about either of those things, but I feel like these two are solid options for you to kind of mix and match from. And of course the Diadem of Arcane Synergy is from Act 1, and the Helmet of Arcane Acuity is from Act 2, so you can just go for a one and then the other, depending on what you want. Next up, the Mantle of the Holy Warrior. I wanted a cape on this build. Sorry, Edna mode. And then this one gives us Crusader's Mantle without having to spend a spell slot, which is nice. Obviously, completely optional, throw whatever you like in here. And it's also coloured red. With Feywild Green and Dundon, it goes for a red and green Christmassy colour, which I actually feel like almost works, but it's up to you. But of course, let's go down to the armour here, and this was the armour that I decided to grab that kind of saved this build. This is the Dark Justiciar Half Plate. I mean, it's an amazing looking armour, I already went over this. While obscured, the wearer has advantage on stealth checks. You also have advantage on Constitution saving throws. That is what we needed. We needed advantage on Constitution saving throw checks to make sure that we can maintain our concentration, and even though I was having real trouble with concentration checks prior to equipping this armour, once I equipped this armour, I basically didn't fail concentration checks anymore. It's pretty damn good. It's a base 16 armor class, so with our dexterity it's going to be an 18 when everything is said and done, which is the same amount as the heavy armor I was originally going to recommend for this build, so that's fine. But of course, obviously as an earlier game option, you can go for my original recommendation, which was going to be Adamantine Splint, because it also looks quite nice in this color scheme. I think it does look quite good, but I do think the Dark Justiciar looks better. But anyways, with the Adamantine Split armor, you reduce all incoming damage by 2. Very nice. And whenever a melee attack hits you, the attacker is sent reeling for 3 turns, so that's another debuff to attack rolls. And attacks can't land critical hits against you. You might find that you prefer this, and again, by wearing this, you actually don't need the Gloves of Dexterity, you just need to have your dex at a base of 10. So feel free to swap that around if you like, but I do think that the lower concentration saves are really problematic with this build, so you are going to probably want to get advantage on concentration checks in some way. So you could either do that maybe with the headpiece, like the Steel Watcher helmet, or the Gibbous of the Worshipful Servant, but unfortunately those are both Act 3, so you'll be waiting a while to get that. So I would still recommend probably using this armor up until Act 3 at the least, even if you do want to swap it out later. And maybe you want to swap it out for the Armor of Agility or the Armor of Persistence. Entirely up to you. Already went over the gloves, so let's look at the Boots of Striding. Whenever you cast a spell that requires concentration, you gain momentum for 1 turn, and while you're concentrating, you cannot be knocked prone or moved against your will. This just allows you to get stuck into the thick of it, meaning that you're not going to lose your concentration to slipping on surfaces, or those goddamn Steel Watcher overhead attacks that knock you prone and drop your concentration every bloody time. The Boots of Striding are just going to be a really solid early game option that will last throughout the whole game and still be useful. It is a free slot, feel free to swap it out to something else if you feel like something else would be more useful, but I do just think this is a solid option across the whole game. The other thing I will say is that I do have a pair of gloves that you could pick up if you do decide to use heavy armor, and that is the Reviving Hands. Whenever you heal the creature, it gains the effects of Blade Ward, meaning that it has resistance to physical damage. And whenever you revive a creature, it gains the effect of Death Ward, meaning that the next time it would die, it drops to 1 HP instead. It also gives you a free usage of Revivify. So if you do decide to go with heavy armor, maybe the Armor of Persistence, and drop that dexterity, and drop the Gloves of Dexterity, you can go for the Reviving Hands instead to gain another really useful buff for the whole party. So there's another option there for you. Next up for our amulet, the Amulet of the Devout. A +2 bonus to spell save DC for both of our spellcasting modifiers, so that's great, both our Bard and our Cleric spells are going to benefit from this, and we gain an additional use of Channel Divinity once per long rest. That means that now we have 2 per short rest, and we gain an extra 1 every long rest, so that means up to 3 in a day, which is really, really nice. It just fits perfectly for this build, so I wanted to bring it here. Next up for our rings, we have the Ring of Mental Inhibition. Whenever a foe fails a saving throw against one of your spells or actions, they gain Mental Fatigue for 2 turns. Mental Fatigue means that they're going to have a -1 penalty to their Wisdom, Intelligence, and Charisma saves, and when they have 5 or more stacks, they take a bit of psychic damage. This is again meant to be a way to debuff our enemies, because we're also going to be buffing our allies. We also kind of want to debuff our enemies, but you can swap this out for something else if you like. I would maybe recommend the either maybe the Ring of Protection for a bit more AC, or perhaps even the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel if you decide to take more illusion and enchantment spells with your bard levels. That could also work, giving you another thing to do with your bonus action if you perhaps run out of War Priest charges. So feel free to swap this out if you like, but I quite liked this one here, because again, a lot of our equipment is about buffing our allies, but we also have quite a few abilities for debuffing our enemies, so I wanted to kind of pick this up too. I think it works quite nicely with Vicious Mockery. And speaking of buffing our allies, the Whispering Promise, pretty much a standard on any build that loves healing, because whenever we heal a creature, either ourselves or an ally, we gain Bless for 2 turns, a d4 bonus to attack rolls and saving throws. The attack rolls are great, I mean, I don't even need to explain that one. Our saving throws are also brilliant. That's going to help us ourselves with our own concentration saves, an extra d4 in addition to the advantage. This is why we're never dropping concentration with this build now. I thought this was going to be enough to carry the concentration saves of the build originally, but it honestly wasn't, surprisingly enough, but with the advantage, it is. And overall, I believe that is the build. Like I say, everything is coloured in Feywild Green and Dun Dun Dye, which is just brilliant. And like I said, this build is really fun. It gets you everything you want for an actual playthrough of Baldur's Gate. The utility from playing a Cleric, the utility from playing a Bard. You gain a ton of battlefield control, melee options, ranged options. You just get everything you could possibly want. Again, and I feel like for Shadowheart, who was one of the early game companions in this build, in my opinion, does fit her quite well. Like, just slap this on your Shadowheart and your whole playthrough is going to feel like it's getting that little bit of extra bump that it needs. This is probably one of those builds I definitely say probably feels the best to play throughout the whole game, or at least have in your party, even as an origin build or a companion, whatever you want to do. I just feel like it works really, really nicely. I like the theming, I like the look of the build, I like how it kind of works out mechanically. It just kind of does everything. Again, if it gets, again, on its own, it's going to struggle a little bit, but as soon as you get at least one other ally next to this thing, you're not going to have any problems at all. And again, this build does stand pretty damn well on its own. I mean, especially kind of in the early to mid game. It's only in like the late game where it might struggle if it gets caught out of position, but being able to have powerful melee attacks as well as access to just everything else in general, it's going to feel really, really good to play. Anyways, that's probably going to do it for me today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.